Before we start sewing, we have to prep our strips to sew. So in this case, I'm going to remove the purple one for now because I'm going to be stitching these two together. I want the pink strip to be to the right of the center strip here, and so I have it laying right there. Now what I want to do is flip it over and put them pretty sides touching. What I call the pretty side is obviously the pretty side of the fabric, and what I call the ugly side is what you would call either the wrong side of the fabric or the ugly side, okay? So you want pretty sides of the fabric touching. I'll flip it here, and since I want the pink strip to be to the right, my seam needs to be right here along the right edge of the strip. So now I'll pin it. When you pin, there's two different ways of pinning your fabric. Horizontally, like you see in this pin, or vertically, like you see here. Whatever you do, no matter which way you put them on your sewing machine, you want to make sure that you do not sew over your pins, okay? It's very dangerous. The tip of your needle can break and it can go flying, can hit your eye. It's just dangerous, so I don't recommend it. The way I like to pin my fabric is horizontally, because as I'm stitching on my sewing machine, before I get up to my pin, I can just pull it and throw it on my pin holder and just continue stitching. Whereas with a vertically placed pin, you can't really see the tip, so when you're sewing, you might catch it with your sewing machine needle, and you just want to stay away from that in general. Okay, so I'm going to pin, matching the raw edges. That means these two edges, make sure that they match, so it's nicely and placed exactly on top. I'll just place a few pins here, just to keep my fabric from moving while I sew. And now we're ready to start stitching our first seam. As we begin stitching our strips together, we want to remember to take a few backward stitches at the beginning, or what we call back tacking. My machine has the reverse right here, so if I hold this and as I continue to stitch, it'll send it in reverse order, okay, so basically backwards. What back tacking does is that it reverses onto the previous stitches that you stitched, and it allows it to hold it together so that they don't come apart at the top. So I'll take one or two stitches and then I'll go back a few and then keep going. As you see me stitching, you'll see that I'm lining up the edge of my fabric with the edge of my presser foot. That's what I recommend for beginners, okay? Seam allowances can be really confusing. For example, when you're making clothes or garments, you'll use a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. For quilters, we use 1/4 inch seam allowances. But in this case, just go with the edge of your foot and line it up, okay? I stop right before I reach my pin, slide the pin out, and continue stitching. Remember, do not sew over your pins. Now this last bit that doesn't have a pin, I just like to use my fingers and make sure that the edges are matching. And just like we back tacked at the beginning, we now want to back tack at the end as well. And you see, both our strips are now sewn together. Now that we've stitched these two strips together, we're going to open it, spread it open a bit, and finger press. I just like to run my nail up and down that center seam to make sure that that fabric lies flat there. Okay? Now we want to add the purple strip, but remember, I wanted it on the left side. I wanted that blue one in the center. So I'm going to line them up the way it should be when it's finished. And now flip it over so that pretty sides are touching. Now if I put my pins this way, that means I'm left-handed and I'll have to stitch down this way. But I'll flip it since I'm right-handed, make it easier for me. Line up those raw edges, and now just pin in place. If you're just starting and you see that you're having some trouble trying to line up these raw edges, you may want to just incorporate some more pins into that particular seam. In this case, I'm just going to use 4. I think that'll do. Now let's stitch it together. I'm just going to stitch these two together, lower my presser foot. Remember to back tack at the beginning and at the end of your seams. Pull those pins out as I go. Now as you're stitching, you want to make sure that you're just keeping your eye on that guide. In this case, we said it was the edge of my presser foot. Do not look at the sewing needle, okay? You'll get confused that way, and it's easy for you to move the fabric and throw your seam allowance off. Just keep your eye on the fabric and lining it up with the edge of your presser foot. Now as you see with my hand, I'm not pulling or tugging or even pushing with this hand the fabric. I'm simply guiding it. Okay, there's some little teeth underneath your foot that are pulling the fabric forward as you stitch. So even if you don't push it, it's still going to go through. Back tack. And we're done with that one. Now that we've stitched the purple strip on as well, we want to open it. You see how it flaps open? You want to hold it down with your fingers and run your nail or your finger just up and down to hold that seam open in place there. And that's going to be the front of your eye pillow. Now that we have our front piece together, we're now going to cut the backing piece to match this. However, I didn't have you cut the back piece yet because I wanted you to sew the strips together first. As a beginning sewer, oftentimes you don't get the seam allowance just right, and in some spots you'll sew a little bit thinner or thicker, so you just want to end up with your final 3 strips together. Now we measure, okay, and based off of this measurement, then we'll cut the backing fabric to match. So I can see here it's 3.5 inches for me. Okay, that's what I ended up with. 3.5 inches by 10. So what I'm going to do is now cut from the blue fabric the same size, 3.5 inches by 10. I have a fresh cut edge here that I cut previously, so I'll line it up with that, actually this way, so I can use that fresh edge. And I'm going to cut my 3.5 inches first. Again, we run into the same dilemma where my ruler is not as long as the fabric, so we fold it in half. Line up that freshly cut raw edge. There we are. Now I'm going to look for my 3.5. This silky fabric is a little bit difficult to work with just because it moves on you, so just be patient with it. 3.5, okay. Cut my strip, and now we need to cut 10 the opposite way. Remember the length. So we'll do the same technique that we did with the strips. Fold it in half. Place that folded edge under the 5. Okay, and cut. Now we have our 3.5 inch by 10 and our 3.5 inch by 10. We're ready to put our eye pillow together.